She took a knife, and beginning with the fingers, shoved the blade into both of the girl's arms. Needles inserted into lips, arms, shoulders, and beneath fingernails. Girls made to stand naked in the freezing Hungarian winter, and according to multiple witnesses, she watched. If the girl, in her pain, in her desperation, actually pulled the needle out, Elizabeth would then cut off that finger with a knife. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and this is her story. To understand Elizabeth Bathory, you must first understand the world she was born into. The year was 1560. Europe was a continent on fire, not with the flames of war alone, but with religious conflict, political betrayal, and the absolute, unchecked power of the nobility. In this world, noblemen and noblewomen were practically untouchable. They owned the land, they owned the people who worked it, and they answered to almost no one. Into this world, on the 7th of August, 1560, Elizabeth Bathory was born. She entered life not as a commoner, not as a peasant, but as a member of one of the most powerful and influential noble families in all of Hungary. The House of Bathory was no ordinary family. They were royalty in every sense of the word, commanding vast territories, wielding enormous political influence, and counted among the most feared names in Central Europe. Her father was Baron George VI Bathory, a powerful nobleman from the Ext branch of the family. Her mother, Baroness Anna Bathory, was from the equally powerful Somlyo branch. Elizabeth was a Bathory on both sides of her family tree. Through her mother, Elizabeth was the niece of Stephen Bathory, a man who would go on to become Prince of Transylvania and King of Poland. Her family did not merely occupy rooms in the halls of power. They built those halls. Elizabeth spent her early childhood at Ext Castle, a grand and imposing fortress that matched the grandeur of the family name. She was raised with every privilege available in the 16th century. She learned Latin, she learned German, she spoke Hungarian and Greek. She received an education that most men of her time could only dream of. From the outside, Elizabeth Bathory had everything, but inside the walls of that castle, something was already going wrong. From a very early age, Elizabeth showed signs that something was deeply troubling about her mind and her health. As a child, she suffered from multiple violent seizures, episodes that, at the time, were referred to as falling sickness. Today, historians believe she may have suffered from epilepsy, but in the 1560s, there was no such clinical understanding. Instead, the treatments prescribed for her condition were disturbing. At the time, it was believed that rubbing the blood of a healthy person onto the lips of an epileptic could help cure them. Elizabeth, as a young child, had blood rubbed on her face as medicine. Some historians have pointed to this early and repeated exposure to blood, presented as healing, as necessary, as normal, as one of the psychological seeds of what was to come later in her life. But there were other shadows over her childhood as well. Some sources suggest that Elizabeth was trained from a young age to be cruel. That the family itself, with all its power and pride, modeled a coldness and a harshness that seeped into her character. And then there were the rumors. When Elizabeth was just 13 years old, before her first marriage, before she had even stepped into adulthood, she allegedly gave birth to a child. The child, said to have been fathered by a peasant boy, was secretly given away to a trusted local woman, who was paid for her silence. The child was then taken far away, to Wallachia. This story surfaced long after Elizabeth's death, carried in the mouths of peasants and servants. Its truth cannot be confirmed with certainty, but it tells us something important. Even before she was a woman, Elizabeth Bathory's life was already wrapped in secrecy, in shame, and in the kind of stories that travel in whispers. In 1574, when Elizabeth was just 14 years old, her future was decided for her. As it was for all noble women of her time, she was engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy. Nadasdy was the son of one of Hungary's most respected noble families. He was ambitious, military-minded, and deeply embedded in the political circles that ruled the Kingdom of Hungary. The engagement was not a love story. It was a political arrangement, a merging of two powerful family lines, a strengthening of alliances, a transaction of power. On the 8th of May, 1575, when Elizabeth was 15 years old, she and Ferenc Nadezhdy were married. The wedding was lavish, as befitting two of the most powerful families in Hungary. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave Elizabeth something that would become forever linked to her name. The castle of Székely, sitting high in the Little Carpathians. Cold, isolated, its stone walls thick with centuries of silence. It was a castle of shadows, and it would become the stage for Elizabeth Bathory's darkest acts. After their wedding, the couple settled at Nadezhdy's castle in Sarver. In time, Elizabeth bore several children, Anna, Orsalia, Catalin, Andras, and Paul, but the marriage was far from a peaceful domestic life. In 1578, just 3 years after their wedding, Ferenc Nadezhdy was appointed chief commander of the Hungarian troops. His country needed him, and so he left, again and again, to wage war against the Ottoman Empire. And Elizabeth was left alone. Alone to manage the estates. Alone to govern the lands. Alone in a castle that whispered to her from its cold stone walls. For years, Elizabeth managed the family's affairs with a sharp mind and an iron will. She was responsible for the medical care of the people on her land. She was charged with the defense of her husband's estates. By all accounts, she was capable. She was intelligent. She was formidable. But something was festering in the darkness. Between the years of 1590 and the early 1600s, stories began to emerge from the villages surrounding Elizabeth's castles. Quiet stories. Hushed stories. The kind of stories people tell only when they are certain no one of power is listening. Peasant girls were disappearing. Young women who went to work as servants in Bathory's household did not come back. Or they came back wrong. Broken in ways that no one could explain. With wounds that no one could account for. With eyes that had seen something they refused to describe. In a time and a place where peasants had no voice against nobility, these whispers meant nothing. Complaints were not made. Investigations were not launched. The disappearances were absorbed into the silence of the powerful. But the stories kept coming. Then, in 1601, something changed. Ferenc Nadezhdy began to fall ill. The illness started in his legs. Debilitating pain that grew worse with every year. By 1603, he was permanently disabled. The great military man was reduced to helplessness. On the 4th of January, 1604, Ferenc Nadezhdy died. He was 48 years old. Before he died, he entrusted the care of his heirs and his widow to a man named Georg Thurzo, one of the most powerful officials in the kingdom. It was a decision that would, years later, seal Elizabeth Bathory's fate. With her husband gone, Elizabeth was now completely alone. A widow. A powerful one. Yes. But alone. And it was in this aloneness, this unchecked freedom, that the darkness she had been carrying for decades finally broke free of its cage. Between 1602 and 1604, the whispers had grown loud enough that a Lutheran minister named István Magyari made formal complaints against Elizabeth Bathory. Both publicly, and at the royal court in Vienna. He had heard what was happening in her castles. He had heard the stories that the peasants told. And he was not willing to stay silent. His complaints, at first, were largely ignored. Elizabeth was nobility. She was a Bathory. The law did not touch women like her. But the minister kept pressing. And the stories kept growing. Because by the time of her husband's death, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer merely frightening the servants. She had become something far worse. Something that, in the years to come, would shock a king, horrify a kingdom, and leave a stain on history that has never fully faded. In our next episode, we go inside the walls of Castle Székely. We will hear, in the words of real witnesses, people who testified under oath, exactly what Elizabeth Bathory did behind those cold stone walls. What she did to the girls who came to serve her. What she did to the young women who trusted her. What she did when no one was watching. Or so she thought. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to Story Hour USA. Because this series is only just beginning, and the worst is yet to come.